Hello and welcome to Ethics and Society. This is week 6, in which we're going to look at the pros and cons of euthanasia. I'm going to combine both of the modules together because they're not really that long, and I think we can get the gist of the idea from both the pro and the con positions without really having to go into a tremendous amount of detail. So typically I divide them up, but week 6 will be all in one. And the idea that I'd like to present here is a fairly straightforward one, and that is the notion of euthanasia. Before we go any further, what I want to do is stress to you the difference between active and passive euthanasia. We will look at active euthanasia, or doctor-assisted suicide, in the first set of slides, and then look at passive euthanasia in the second set of slides when we argue against euthanasia. Because that is very, very important. That distinction is important to consider in one's moral understanding or ethical understanding of the issue of euthanasia. Now, the single most powerful argument, the belief, is that this is the argument of mercy. And this is the argument that is presented by James Rachel, who's the gentleman here, who is the author and editor of the book that we use for this course. And surprisingly, he contracted cancer, and he actually decided to follow through with doctor-assisted suicide. Now, that's not the reason why. He wrote this beforehand. There's a strange irony in how his life concluded. But even before he became sick, he still argued the same thing, that the argument for euthanasia is the argument of mercy. And it is rather elegant and simple to simply have mercy for individuals who are suffering terminally, of course. And that's the key phrase here. So by keeping terminally ill patients firmly in mind, right, we appreciate the full force of the argument of mercy. If a person prefers death as the only alternative to lingering on in a kind of torment, and of course these days medical science can prolong the life of someone almost immeasurably, almost to the point of a vegetative state, where the quality of life is no longer the issue. It's simply someone who is alive because they have a pulse. So if the person prefers death as the only alternative to something like that, then surely it is immoral not to help that person die sooner. So that's essentially the utilitarian perspective. It's also the perspective that James Rachel takes as a utilitarian. So let's kind of unpack this position so we understand it carefully. So utilitarians argue that actions and social policies should be judged as right or wrong exclusively. But it turns out that euthanasia, if we look at it exclusively in terms of increasing happiness, it turns out that euthanasia can be morally acceptable to utilitarians for the following reasons. So let's see how sound the argument is. Okay, if we are exclusively looking at the increase in happiness, overall happiness, and if that is the case, we should accept the notion of euthanasia for the two reasons. Yes, because it increases the amount of individual happiness in the world, decreases the amount of individual misery, and also because it decreases the amount of misery in general. So let's see whether this argument actually is sound. Now, it turns out that the utilitarian position is perhaps not fully comprehensive, because the promotion of happiness is certainly not the only thing that we saw last week, for example, aesthetic enjoyment, well-being. There are other things that could be defined as happy, or certainly happiness. So the avoidance of misery, the avoidance of unhappiness is not the only issue that we should consider. So it's one amongst many other things. And this is where it becomes important when we expand the notion of happiness and we start talking about an individual's rights. Now, again, last week we talked about how utilitarians can sometimes run roughshod over individual rights. Here we have something quite different. Here we have individual happiness almost superseding everything else, because this is, again, where utilitarians have a fair amount of wiggle room, because their definition of happiness can be both wide or it can be narrow. Here there are several things that are going on. Not only overall happiness, people will conclude their grief because a loved one has now passed away peacefully under their own conditions. There's also the notion of freedom. The person has exercised their individual rights to follow through with a belief and a desire to end their life. There's a notion of justice, that this person has not been ignored, has not been silenced or marginalized or simply just not paid attention to. There's a sense of justice in the way in which that person was listened to and accommodated. So it's not as if the notion of euthanasia from a utilitarian perspective is unjust. The notion of freedom of right, freedom of choice, the justice that is inherent in listening to that person and allowing them to follow through with that which they desire, and the respect for other people's rights. These elements, these aspects are what we should think about when we talk about the happiness that is associated with euthanasia, because someone dying typically does not equal happiness, quite the opposite. But again, utilitarians wish to be very kind of pragmatic, right? Very practical about the way in which they define freedom. And here it is this kind of wider latitude of freedom, justice, and respect for other people's rights. Now, the question becomes, if that's the case, if all of those issues are valid and worth considering, what if somebody is just unhappy, just miserable? They're chronically depressed. They just cannot see any kind of way out of the situation that they're in, but they're not terminally ill. Now, this is a serious issue because it's going on right now in Quebec and has been now for several months, where the issue of euthanasia for individuals who are not terminally ill. In Quebec, there is basically a charter of freedoms challenge by individuals who believe that they should also be allowed to follow through with doctor-assisted suicide. And it is really important because where do we draw the line at unhappiness? Is it caused by a terminal illness? Is it caused by chronic depression or abject depression, crippling forms of anxiety? Can those things be considered on an equal footing with a terminal illness? So if that issue is there, we need to be very careful as to how we define happiness, because we are talking about freedom and justice and respecting people's rights. But we also have to consider the fact that there are others that may not be terminally ill, but look at euthanasia as a possible way out. So if we allow these people to follow through, let's say someone who's abjectly depressed or crippling anxiety that just cannot function. Now, would it not decrease the amount of misery in the world if we allowed these people to follow through with doctor-assisted suicide? It's an important question. So we have to ask ourselves, is the utilitarian perspective, right, a good or adequate guide to figure out right and wrong, or do we need to look at something else? So utilitarians don't give us a conclusive answer in terms of the issues we just raised, but they are certainly worth considering. But utilitarians still turn around and say, look, even if the promotion of happiness and the avoidance of misery are not the only morally important issues, because there is freedom, respecting individual rights, the notion of justice, they are still important in and of themselves. So if that's the case, if we can look at it from that perspective, then we can get on board, we'll say, with the utilitarian perspective regarding euthanasia. Because utilitarians wish for us to consider that not only is individual suffering eliminated by euthanasia, but the patient has requested it. So the person, the individual, who otherwise would be basically steamrolled over in the hope of raising the level of happiness in society at large, in the issue of euthanasia, it's case by case. And so individual suffering will be eliminated by euthanasia. And again, this is active euthanasia because it is doctor-assisted suicide. And the patient has requested it. And there is no violation of human rights. This is the important issue. So it's the violation of human rights that would be otherwise tantamount to an injustice. So the two of them work really well together. Respecting individual rights and justice really are sort of flip sides of the same coin. Now, in Canada, this website here will give us an awful lot of information, and I've already opened it up. So let's see here. This is, I'm going to move it over just a little bit. So the Government of Canada website, information on medical assistance in dying, right? Lots of information medical assistance in dying, or known as MAID. You can scroll down the entire page. There's information on medical assistance in dying, eligibility criteria, very important. Obtaining medical assistance in dying, roles from provinces and territories, monitoring reporting, independent reviews, supporting palliative care, end-of-life care options. So even here, even though this is a page put up by the government who have made doctor-assisted suicide legal, there's still the option for palliative care, which means end-of-life care. Individuals that go into palliative care rarely come out alive, but it is the last place that individuals can go to get the medical care that they deserve and they need, because if anything, it does alleviate their pain. So supporting palliative care, there's still a link here for people to pursue that. So it's not, you must do this. Once you click here, you're in, right? There's no way out. Absolutely, there's a way out. All this information is going to help people to understand the options both for and in lieu of, or instead of, doctor-assisted suicide. So I just wanted to point that out to you here as we set ourselves back up. And there we go. So in the end, utilitarians believe that their view of euthanasia is in the best interest of everyone that is there. So if we go back and we revise the argument and we take a look at it and say, okay, what is really at issue here? And it is the following three things. If an action is in the best interest of everyone concerned and violates no one's rights, then that action is morally acceptable. Now, it doesn't turn around and address let's say the reluctance the family may have to allow a patient to follow through with doctor-assisted suicide. The focus seems to be more on the patient than on the family, the immediate family and friends. But certainly, the patient is is the primary focus, because they are the ones that have decided to follow through with this. But still, it's odd that it's phrased this way. If an action is in the best interest of everyone concerned, very general statement, and violates no one's rights, specifically the case of the patient, then that action is morally acceptable. 2, in at least some cases, active euthanasia or doctor-assisted suicide promotes the best interest of everyone concerned and violates, again, no one's rights. Therefore, if the two premises are correct and followed through, therefore, in some cases, active euthanasia is morally responsible or acceptable. So the belief that this is the way to go is really the utilitarian viewpoint of saying that it does not violate people's rights. The individual who requests it is able to follow through with it. But as I said, I would like to raise the issue of, for example, the friends and family who may wish to hold out hope, and yet the individual says, no, I'm done. What about a doctor that is approached to follow through? What about their moral obligations? What about their religious background? What about their ethical feelings towards euthanasia? Because a doctor essentially signs a Hippocratic oath to do no harm. This runs completely counterproductive to their belief that we should help. So when we talk about everyone's rights, let's be careful of whose rights we're kind of not talking about. They're kind of generally there, but the assumption is that everything's going to be okay. So keep that in mind as you sort of work through the argument and the position that utilitarians take. So if that's the issue, and we are able to resolve it, then we end up kind of with a revised position that we've just described, that it does not violate anyone's rights, that the patient is able to follow through, and in most cases, active euthanasia, in other words, the patient has control over this procedure. We'll talk about passive euthanasia very shortly, but I want you to be clear in your mind. Active euthanasia is doctor-assisted suicide, and it is a condition under which the patient is aware of what's going on, has requested it, understands what's going on, is consciously aware of the procedure that is about to happen, but they are still the one that ultimately makes that choice. The doctor does not directly inject something into the patient or does not directly put the pills into that patient's mouth. Ultimately, it is the patient who does it. So if the last second they back out, they can back out. It's like having informed consent, but with the option to walk away at the last moment. And it can happen because when people suddenly are faced with that dilemma, they may back out. So just because everything is in place, the pills are on the table, the patient does not have to take them, obviously, because otherwise it would be the worst kind of injustice. That would be murder. So let's look at it again. Euthanasia remains, right, this acceptable form of behavior from a utilitarian point of view if we talk about happiness that includes freedom, justice, and respect of individual rights. It will be in the best interest of the patient's family and friends, the hospital staff, right, who can now turn their attention to other patients, and also the patient's rights. So the patient and the patient's rights certainly are one and the same, but let's make that distinction. The patient's rights have not been violated. And that's really essentially it. So the key points here, and there are several, but I think they're all kind of interconnected and they're very clear, I believe. Okay, from that utilitarian perspective, euthanasia is morally acceptable if it serves to increase happiness and decrease misery. It will decrease the amount of misery in the world. Therefore, such a policy is morally right. And we have to, again, have a kind of a wider scope in terms of our definition of happiness, because it should also include freedom of choice, the justice that is being meted out on behalf of the patient, and the respect for human rights, and it's certainly the patient's rights. So that is very, very important. It is their definition that we wish to use. So again, if that is correct, then what we have is an example of active euthanasia. And it promotes the best interests of everyone concerned. Again, I wish for you to consider the possibility of a doctor maybe saying no and not wishing to follow through because to them it's immoral. The doctor should at least have the ability to recommend someone else, because again, you would be infringing on a person's rights by refusing to follow through with it. Just because one doctor says, no, I will not follow through with this, it's against my religion or my ethical upbringing or whatever, perhaps they can recommend another doctor. So there's that possibility. So it's in the best interest of everyone involved. It promotes the best interest of any of those concerned because it allegedly violates no one's rights. So if everyone's on board, the doctor will perform the euthanasia. The family and friends are prepared for it, and the patient is ready as well. Then there's no reason why we should not follow through. If for us to consider the plight that these individuals are in and look at it from a perspective of mercy, then it is in fact the right thing to do. So I'm going to just take a very short break and I'm going to switch out the slides and we're going to go on to part 2. Okay, so here we are with part 2 of module 6, 6B we'll call it, where we're going to look at some arguments against euthanasia. Now, the first time I taught this would be 5 years ago roughly, I did not know the following fact, but I think it's worth considering because in trying to present, objective arguments, we also need to hear both sides of those positions. So it turns out that I was not the only one that was wondering who J. Gay Williams was, because it was a name I'd never heard before. And sure enough, when you fire up Google, you start typing something, and as soon as I typed in, who is J, and I just typed in the G, who is J. Gay Williams? Oh, okay. That's kind of odd because somebody else has typed the same thing. So of course I clicked on it and looked. Well, this is rather interesting. It turns out that J. Gay Williams, the blog, the information I found, it looked pretty substantial because I found it sort of repeated in a couple of other ones. So it sounds like it's correct. J. Gay Williams is actually an acronym for Ronald Munson. And Ronald Munson is a philosopher and a writer. And he had put together a book called Intervention and Reflections in 2013. And he wanted to include an article that defended the position against euthanasia. But he found that all the articles that were out there were actually not very good. They're not really well written for a variety of reasons. So he decided to write his own. So although he says he does not endorse the position, so in other words, he's in favor of euthanasia, he wrote an article that tried very hard to argue against euthanasia. And I think he does raise some important points. And these are the points that I sort of inferred in the first half, where we talked about active euthanasia and the rights of individuals. So let's take a look at this in kind of a little bit more detail. So J.G. Williams, or aka Ronald Munson, believes that euthanasia is gaining acceptance because of the fact that society is sort of increasingly kind of unthinking and uncritical in their sympathy. And yes, we want to be benevolent to others, but we're not kind of thinking it through. We want to feel as if we are good citizens. We want to argue in favor of something that appears to be beneficial. But as you can imagine, in this day and age, he was writing in 2013, and it's only gotten worse. People are increasingly uncritical, right? People are increasingly not thinking about what they're reading and discussing, because partly the reason is people are entrenched in their positions. They refuse to hear any kind of opposing viewpoint. That opposing viewpoint is always simply just wrong or fake news or whatever. Let's try to stay on track here. So Munson is arguing right now the society and us individuals in living in society are kind of uncritical about this kind of benevolence we have towards euthanasia. We're really not thinking about it. In other words, especially the issue, let's say, of capital punishment. Those of us that believe in it, if you believe in it, would you be willing to watch one? Would you be willing to watch someone put to death? And this is kind of what he's implying. We may not have experienced it. We may not have sort of thought about it all the way through. But again, this is Munson's position, and he wishes to articulate something that is worth considering. And he says, look, it's a slippery slope, right, from such a human response to the view that someone would be, as he says, better off dead. And that's kind of scary, that someone would simply be better off dead. That's kind of taking a default position in terms of illness that is downright frightening. And that's exactly what he's asking us to think about. If that's the case, then we be all right to kill other people for other reasons in the first place. And that slippery slope, we'll talk about that in more detail when we talk about eugenics, because eugenics is a very good example of this slippery slope. But what Munson is talking about here is this notion that, first of all, we simply accept sort of tacitly or uncritically the notion of euthanasia. And what he's afraid of is that we might slide down this slippery slope, which again is not a good way to argue, but he's asking us to consider something. He has no proof, right? This is where the slippery slope idea comes in. He has no proof that if someone would be simply considered better off dead, that we would follow through with it. But it is something that he thinks we should be concerned with. Now, he respects compassion, right, that leads to this conclusion, but he also believes the conclusion is in fact wrong. It's incorrect because it really is coming from the standpoint of self-interest, and the self-interest that we would have, because now in the first half, hopefully noticed that I was putting the emphasis on the patient, right, and only secondarily on the family and friends and doctors and so on. Here, Munson fears that the family will try to kind of take over and will impose their rights on the doctors and on the hospital to basically pull the plug on someone, right? To follow through with passive euthanasia, which we'll define more carefully. But the notion of being better off dead, this would be something that other individuals, not the patients, but others would start to think about. And it's that Munson is really concerned with. So with euthanasia, right, it is basically taking a human life, right? Taking a human life. That's it, the long and the short of it. And Munson is quite concerned with the fact that we're not thinking about that. Because when you think about euthanasia, it's what George Carlin would say, a soft word, right? George Carlin, fantastic comedian, brilliant mind when it came to exploring language. And he talks about soft words. And what he means by that are words that hide what the action actually is. He talks about, for example, PTSD. And he says, almost 100 years ago, it used to be shell shock, right? It's like shell shock. It almost it almost sounds like the thing itself. And now in 2020, we talk about post-traumatic disorder, PTSD. It's softened, right? We're moving further away from describing the thing in its reality and softening up what it really is. And euthanasia, for Munson, I believe, is doing the same thing. If we talk about, murder, people freak out. But euthanasia is sort of softer. And again, what Munson, I think, is really concerned with is passive euthanasia, which is a deliberate and intentional withholding of medication. And that is what he's most afraid of. So it's an unintended death that results from withholding medication. Now think about why someone would have medication in the first place. They're in pain. And think about it. This is pain unto death. A pain so awful and so hard and so intense that it will kill you. And so passive euthanasia is this withdrawing of the medication because the notion is, well, they're going to die anyway, so they're just better off dead. So we'll withhold the medication. Well, first of all, that sounds rather cruel because I couldn't imagine the intensity of the pain of something that eventually will kill you. It sounds like something many of us could not withstand for very long. Secondly, it is a way to die that is really awful. So Munson, I think, is really concerned with this notion of passive euthanasia, which is deliberately killing someone by withholding medication. And if you do that, it is probably one of the worst forms of death because doctors are supposed to do no harm. So this is essentially Munson's argument. And he's very concerned about it because he can see something like this happening if the climate is such that individuals kind of go to a default position of, well, they're better off dead. And so if that is the case, it is unjust or unjust in the worst way possible. Because Munson believes that every human being has a natural inclination to continue to live. Think of all the movies that we've watched over the years of people in these awful predicaments, whether they're attacked by zombies or aliens or whatever, it doesn't matter. And they will fight tooth and nail to survive. And many stories, many gripping stories, are stories of survival. And so we as human beings, according to Munson, have this drive to survive. And euthanasia, in a sense, violates that. It's unjust because it goes against this natural goal that we have to survive. And if that's the case, and it's going against our own nature, think about natural laws, right? And we've kind of alluded to them a little bit when we talked about Thomas Hobbes. Natural laws, the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. Euthanasia is exactly the opposite. It is the end of all those things. So, and again, passive euthanasia, this is not active where it is doctor-assisted suicide, but Munson is implying a culture of better off dead, quote unquote, individuals looking at someone who is sick, maybe terminally ill or not, but going to that default position right away, saying, look, we're going to save ourselves a ton of money. They're better off dead anyway, and anyway they go. But all of this goes against our human nature, against our natural laws to maintain our ability to survive, and ultimately, once we survive, to be happy, right? And to be able to pursue these things. So euthanasia, according to Munson, actually sets us against our own human nature. It is unnatural. And he says it violates our human dignity, our autonomy, because ultimately, what if you slip into unconsciousness and you do this in a climate of better off dead, and of course in the US, where medical expenses are insanely expensive. Imagine the pressure there to euthanize someone because you're looking at this person saying, oh my God, they're going to be in the hospital for the next 6 months. They're not going to make it. Let's just off them now. Like, let's just do it now. You've already slipped into unconsciousness. You have no say in the matter. And you're doing this in a climate of better off dead. So it becomes very terrifying. And that's what I mean when I say whether or not Munson believes the point. He does bring up some interesting ideas that may be specific to the U.S. because of the incredibly high cost of medical, the medical expenses. which is not to say we don't have something similar in Canada, but for the most part, in Canada, we do have protection. We do have universal health care that we pay with through our taxes, so it's not free, right? We're still paying for it. But I believe in the US, this issue is even more serious simply because of what it costs to put someone in a hospital. So there's that issue. There's the financial imperative to euthanize people sooner, as soon as individuals know that they're sick, or the family knows that the patient is now terminal. Well, what's to stop them, right? There isn't anything to stop them other than their morality. So it is an important idea. Now, Munson continues, because death is final, euthanasia contains with it the possibility that we'll work against our own best interests. What if the next day a cure is found for something? You've just decided to euthanize your parent or friend or loved one of some sort, and then a week later a cure is found. Well, now you've got to live with what you've done, right? And that can be very, very difficult. Just an example that I usually refer to is in the 1980s with HIV and AIDS, many individuals died. It was essentially a death sentence. So individuals that contracted HIV in the 1980s often committed suicide because they did not want to go through the pain, the insufferable pain that they knew they were going to go through, because there was no vaccine. Now there still isn't, but there is a range of medical cocktails that keep people alive. And I have two good friends who were diagnosed in the early 90s, and they are still alive. So we're talking now 30 years they've been alive. And they were lucky that they were not diagnosed sooner in the 1980s, where they may not be with us, now, because they and many others chose to take their own lives because it was literally there was no exit. Once you contracted HIV, it was a death sentence. But here, if you decide that someone is better off dead, you run the risk of not allowing that person to wait just long enough for medicine or some sort of scientific research to turn a corner and find a cure for something. So that's gone as well. So if we do that, right, here are some of the reasons, three of them, that the Munson talks about. Contemporary medicine does not always possess perfect and complete knowledge. A good example, although it's not always fatal, a good example is the mixed messages we've had now over the last, since basically March, about COVID. You've got to wash everything they come in contact with, and now people aren't really talking about that anymore. Some people don't even think wearing a mask is a good idea because they have difficulty breathing. Like, sure they do. Social distancing. Sure, medicine is not an exact science, but certainly we can think about what is being discussed and think, okay, let's apply just a little bit of common sense. Generally speaking, most of what they say is correct. But medicine is not always perfect, and it is an ongoing cumulative, endeavor to find cures for things. So there's always a problem, not having a cure at that time. There's also the possibility of a mistaken prognosis, right? A mistaken diagnosis, and all of a sudden you go to see another doctor and they say, well, no, this is curable. So if you decide that someone is better off dead and you forego that second or third opinion, you run the risk of inadvertently killing someone. So that's one. Two, an experimental procedure might be around the corner. There's always that possibility. And three, knowing that we can take our own lives at any time might also cause patients to give up too early, right? That fight to survive may extinguish sooner. So doctors and nurses, right, are here to save lives. They sign the Hippocratic Oath, or they take a Hippocratic Oath to do no harm. And this is, again, counterproductive to what they do. And if we establish this climate of, quote, better off dead, it could have a corrupting influence on doctors and nurses and practitioners, frontline workers, friends and families of the patient who may or may not be terminal. It becomes corrupting. Because now people start thinking of this default position of simply better off dead. And Munson thinks that if that's the case, then passive euthanasia, the withholding of medication, the stopping of any sort of action to help this person. But again, passive euthanasia, often the doctors will know what's going on. The patient certainly will not. The patient may be unconscious. Even the family may or may not know. So passive euthanasia is really, when you think about it, a rather frightening thing. A decision has been made on your behalf, or even on behalf of your family, to essentially to pull the plug or withhold medication. You don't know. I mean, you and I are not doctors and experts. We don't know what a proper, injection looks like. How many cc's of something. We don't know whether they're being injected with, who knows, a saline solution or something. We don't know. We trust doctors. Remember that notion of trust I've been stressing all along? Here is what it really matters, because they are maintaining someone's life. And if we are living in a climate of quote unquote better off dead, that trust is broken, right? That trust is corrupted. So it is worth thinking about, because there is always that possibility that the person that is taking care of your parents, your grandparents, whatever, maybe, thinking about that in the back of their minds, and they're thinking, well, now's the right time. The family, they're at peace with what's going on. They've accepted the fact that this is terminal. Well, they're better off dead. Now's a good time. But that's what Munson means by passive euthanasia. There's a big difference, right? Active, the patient is fully aware what's going on and has requested euthanasia. Passive is where the patient is not aware that these procedures are happening, in a sense, behind their backs, because they're either unconscious or they just don't know. They've not been notified. And if you withhold medication, that is a painful death, because the notion of death is going to happen. It's going to happen sooner, but under a lot more pain. So, key points on this one. The notion of the compassion argument for euthanasia. Munson thinks that Williams believes that this notion of benevolence and compassion can become corrupted, and it sort of can slide, the slippery slope into this notion of simply, well, they're better off dead. Let's kick in that benevolence even sooner. So we need to be very careful, because if we talk about the standpoints of self-interest and practical applications, that's where you end up thinking that perhaps that person should be euthanized sooner, because it's just more practical. Self-interest, well, I can't afford my parents being in this palliative care unit any longer because it's killing me. I'm going broke. So yeah, let's do it. So many of those things are very, very influential in making decisions about whether or not you wish to follow through with euthanasia. Euthanasia also it involves taking a human life. It is ending the life of another person in a deliberate and intentional way. Now that could be active euthanasia, but also passive euthanasia. The not doing something also will increase the likelihood of someone dying. So either way, especially with passive euthanasia, it's still deliberate and intentional. You have deliberately and intentionally withheld medication. You have deliberately decided not to do something to help that person. And the notion of do no harm, certainly it goes completely out the window. So euthanasia contains within it this possibility that we are thinking more of our own interests rather than the interests of the patient. There is a possibility of mistaken diagnosis or make a mistaken prognosis. You have X number of weeks to live. My one friend who is still HIV went blind 2 years ago, and he went blind 3 years after the doctor that he last saw said, well, at this point you have 6 months to live. So he was told that, still lived 3 more years, and right now he has lost his sight, but he's still alive. So a mistaken diagnosis or prognosis is always possible. There's a possibility of a miracle cure or miracle, strategy or rehabilitation that could be started, which is now no longer available because the person has been euthanized. Knowing that we can take our life at any time is going to maybe make us give up that hope, give up that drive to survive sooner, which is not good. A climate of of Better Off Dead is a corrupting influence on doctors and nurses. And finally, euthanasia just in general for Munson/Gay Williams is a kind of slippery slope, because for all the reasons I've just described, there is this issue that euthanasia is not a personal voluntary thing, but in fact done behind your back by a cabal of doctors and nurses, or they themselves may or may not be sort of in cahoots with the family and friends, a whole range of things. So the idea of euthanasia as a policy that should be unquestioned, right, or looked at uncritically, is very dangerous, because it is there now, and we need to be very careful as to how it is administered. We need to make sure the patients desire and wish for this to happen, and it is not done essentially behind their backs as passive euthanasia. So certainly of the two, passive is the more dangerous and insidious one, because it's one that happens sort of under the radar. The patient will not know. Clearly the doctors and nurses will, but the patients may not know, and certainly the family and friends may not know. Or if they do, ultimately the patient, who is the one who will suffer the most, is the one who knows the least. So that's essentially the pros and cons of euthanasia. It will be included in the midterm test that is coming up, but we'll talk about that when we meet on either Wednesday or Thursday, because I have two groups, but we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So take care, and we'll talk to you in a couple of days.